Wait till the light. How come it's not on yet? Yep, there you go. All right.
Centerville City Council is now in session. We appreciate your patience as we've just reconfigured from a work session on moderate income housing plan and the biennial report that's required by the state of Utah. And now we'll start our city council meeting. We'll note for the record that 4 of our 5 city council members are here. Tammy Fillmore had to step out for a personal commitment, and I expect her back later in the meeting. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, which I'll lead, after which we have the privilege of having Mrs. Karen Webb here with us from the Baha'i Faith, which we celebrated last time, who will give us a prayer or a thought. So please stand and join with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Baha'is aren't real good at spontaneous prayer, so this is a prayer from our writings about mankind and its unity. O thou kind Lord, thou hast created. I'm sorry, sometimes I think Centerville is a beacon of light, but outside it's getting very dark. And while we deliberate for the good of Centerville, please keep in mind those who are less fortunate than we are. O thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same original parents. Thou hast intended that all belong to the same household. In thy holy presence they are thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered at thy table of bounty, and are radiant through the light of thy providence. O God, thou art kind to all, thou hast provided for all, thou dost shelter all, thou dost confer life upon all. Thou hast endowed all with the talents and faculties. All are submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. O thou kind Lord, unite all. Let the religions agree. Make the nations one so that they may be as one kind and as children of the same fatherland. May they associate in unity and concord. O God, upraise the standard of the oneness of humankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement the hearts together, O God. O thou kind Father, God, exhilarate the hearts through the fragrances of thy love. Brighten the eyes through the light of thy guidance. Cheer the hearing with the melodies of thy word, and shelter us in the cave of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and the powerful. Thou art the forgiving, and thou art the one who overlookest the shortcomings of humankind.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Next on our agenda is the open session, an opportunity for any member of the public to comment on any subject of municipal concern. I invite anyone who would like to speak to come to the podium and state their name and city of residence. We do have a couple of public hearings on the agenda later, so if you want to speak on a specific matter that's on the agenda, we encourage you to do it then. But if you'd like to speak on other matters, the open session is now open. Seeing none, I'll close the open session and we'll move to items on our agenda, the first of which is minutes review and acceptance from the October 17th work session and regular city council meeting minutes. I think I had a note on this. Oh, it must have been on something different. I don't have any changes. Anybody else have any changes to the meeting minutes? If not, I would look for a motion to approve the October 17th work session and regular city council meeting minutes.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. I have a summary action calendar with 4 items on that calendar. And Steve, did you want to comment on the
I do.
CAP construction one before we move forward?
Yes, I need to note that item D involving the PRV, installation of a PRV,
Pressure reducing valve.
pressure
for the
reducing
audience.
valve, thank you for the audience. It was, the labor portion of that, as you know, we typically bid labor separately from materials because we think that's better overall price-wise for the city, but the labor portion was anticipated by the engineer that it was going to be less than $25,000, which is the threshold at which you have to do a formal rather than an informal bidding process. So the city engineer went through an informal process, but he solicited 5 or 6 bids, only got 2 because of the construction climate now. So I engaged in a conversation with him as to whether he thought we could do much better if we waited and did this in a few months. He thought that, well, you might improve the bid by 5 to 10%, but on the other hand, your materials could be higher at that time. Material prices, also you will incur ESI charges, additional ESI charges for conducting a formal bidding process. So it's the opinion of staff that it really isn't going to be a significant benefit to us and might even be more expensive if we were to delay. And so we're recommending that even though this was an informal process, you have the authority in the purchasing policy to waive the requirement for the formal bidding process and to accept the results of this informal bidding process if you agree with staff's recommendation to go forward at this time. But I wanted to add that as a part of the record that if you approve this, that it is also waiving the formal bidding process for the labor portion of this project.
And this is the water project.
Right, the PRV, pressure reducing valve, the labor portion of that.
And we're trying to move on this partly because it's necessary for the developments that we anticipate on.
Yeah, Moto United will be serviced off of this over there in the Hogan Park, and then, of course, the new business park will be serviced by this line that the PRV is going on as well.
Any other questions about items on the summary action calendar?
So we're over by 60% on that item, right?
Instead of the 25,000, you mean it's 36,000 on the labor portion you're talking about, or on the total labor and materials?
Total. If I'm reading it right, total.
Yeah, what is it,
79 versus 50.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 50,000 was not an estimate prepared with any kind of significant engineering to it. It was a number put in the budget that.
It was, I regarded it as a placeholder when I looked at it originally, so this didn't surprise me that it would be a variance. I guess my only question was between the 2 bidders, there's a lot of range between the 2 bidders, so who's missing what between those 2 bidders? That's.
It's a case of maybe contractors.
We are aware that the high bidder has got lots of work, and it was not. Yeah, I think he was trying to do us a favor by bidding, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
If there are no more questions, I'd look for a motion to approve the 4 items on the summary action calendar.
I'll go ahead and make a motion that we approve the 4 items on the summary action calendar.
Second.
It's moved and seconded we approve those 4 items, which is the UDOT Cooperative Agreement for Pedestrian Flags, the fee schedule amendments, which is Resolution 2017-22, waiver and indemnification for Centerville Gun Range, and the awards for the pressure-reducing valve. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. Next up, consider the nomination of Ron's Phillips 66 Service Station for the National Register of Historic Places. We'll have a staff report, I suspect from Cassie on this to start out.
Yeah.
Hello again.
Want to pull that down too. There you go.
All right, I assume that most of you are already familiar with Ron Reynolds gas station. It's become kind of a iconic building already in Centerville on its own. Most of you know Ron. He's been a lifetime citizen of this community, and his service station and gas station have become a gathering spot within this community. Many of you have quite a few memories of the station growing up and his service, and see him riding his horse to work every day, and makes you think of this community in fond ways. This year, the Landmarks Commission commissioned Coral Broshinsky to research Ron Randall's gas station to see if it would be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, which is a national list of historically significant buildings, sites, or districts that are worthy of preservation all across the nation. And she recommended that this station would be nominated to that National Register based on its architectural significance, its local significance to the community, and its unique design and preservation. So this design, as you can see, this picture is from 1974, but the station was built in 1960. It is the Phillips 66 new look for the station, which was still a prototype when it was built. This upwardly canted triangular canopy was influenced by the fins found on automobiles and rockets of the time period, so very new agey for the time. And it's been maintained quite well. It used to have that harlequin paint design, as you can see there, which has since been painted over by a very well-meaning Boy Scout group, but can still be repainted if needed and if wanted to be restored. So Coral researched many gas stations that are on the station, and none of them had this Phillips 66 new look quite the same way that has been maintained continuous for all this time, including the remaining service pumps, which is quite a big deal that they're still there, even though they're not being used anymore. So because of this unique style and the footprint of the building and its maintained usage and those pumps that are still there, and not to mention the local significance of just Ron Randall and all the memories that Center Villagers have here, the Landmarks Commission did decide to go forward with this process to recommend that the City Council put it on the National Register, which is ultimately a state decision, but does need City Council approval as well. The proposed master plan for Founders Park and City Hall does exist, and it was created in 2001. Yep, there you go. And right next to Founders Park, you'll see the driveway to City Hall kind of expanded to what it looks like now. So that's about right here where Ron Randall's gas station lies now. Obviously, this plan does not include the Randall gas station, sadly, but we, as staff, don't think that it ultimately conflicts, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive to each other. We think with some amendments to the master plan here, and looking forward in the future, obviously we don't know when Ron Randall will ever give up that gas station, but it is worthy of preservation nonetheless, and we think that Centerville can possibly amend its master plan to accommodate this preservation effort, so we can maintain its history as well as contributing to our master plan. So the Landmarks Commission was very excited about this project, and I hope you guys are too.
Thank you for that staff report. Any questions for Cassie about the Landmarks Commission, or do you have anything you want to add, Stephanie, being our representative to the Landmark Commission?
This has kind of been discussed at the Landmarks Commission for a while, so it's nice to see it finally get to this point. Years, in fact, I think it came up as a possibility years ago when I was first put on. So thank you for all your efforts, and it really is, if you had to have people say, what one thing in Centerville could you say, oh yeah, I'm in Centerville, I think Ron's gas station would be a top pick for a lot of people.
So I do have a question. So the funds that were used to hire the consultant to do the research, where did those funds come from?
They come from our CLG grant, which is from the Landmarks Commission, so it's matched state and local.
50/50.
Okay, so this is state funded as
It's
well.
half state funded.
Okay.
Yeah, it was, I think it was what, about $3,000 or so for.
And that was including another building. So she researched 2 buildings, one of which didn't quite pass muster, but this one, she said, certainly did. Yeah, and that was maybe 3,000 total.
And the owner expressed interest in wanting to put this property on the
Yep,
register?
we have talked to Ron. I'm a little surprised he isn't here, but he was at the Landmarks Commission meeting with us. And there's really no federal restrictions. There's not a lot of consequence once you're on this list, other than you get a plaque and you're eligible for some tax credits. It's more of a celebration and a recognition rather than a mandated preservation.
I appreciate the report, and it's been an icon for a long time. I also think that the long-term, the city has had a long-term plan to expand Founders Park when the opportunity presents itself. Obviously, not
Which park are you speaking about?
Excuse me, Smith, William R. Smith Park. I have to get used to that. Every 4th of July, I think we all appreciate that the William R. Smith Park is not big enough to fit our celebration, which continues to grow each year. So I think it would be a worthy challenge to try and figure out how do you respect the past while planning for the folks that live here today and what we have in the future. This does not necessarily require a public hearing, but the City Council typically will make that decision whether to recommend it for.
Well, I'm confused on that as, okay, a recommendation is a secondary. It's from what I was looking at, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the property owner asks for it and there is registered information with the state talking about its historical significance, what standing does the council, if they said, no, we don't want it, how does that impact anything?
Well, basically, we need the city council's approval in order to get that state.
But the
According
state
to
already
our-
has the information and already had it on their calendar. So
It does, and it may or may not influence them.
The federal program assigns the state history office as their agent. And so all things are coordinated through the state of history office. And what they require when you participate in historic preservation, they require a local authority, and that is the city council. So the city council is the body in charge of programming preservation efforts into in its city. You've assigned the Landmarks Commission as your agent to do that research. So the Landmarks Commission is tasked with doing that researching, identifying worthy projects, setting goals for funding, and then they submit that to you, and then you send that up to the state with the signature of the mayor for that funding. So the research on Randall Station was part of that 50-50 match grant program. As part of the process, you're required to make recommendations to the state as a local entity. So the Landmarks is saying to you, recommend this to the state. You certainly could not recommend it to the state. So there's 2 ways to drive it. Your first question is, does the owner request it? The owner can request. It would go through the Landmarks, go to the council, and whatever recommendation. Your recommendation could be a positive in the name of the owner, or it could be a negative in the name of the owner. If it's a negative, they will simply take the owner's request and evaluate your findings and reasons from the landmark for why it didn't qualify, and they'll debate that. In this case, it's been the Landmarks Commission initiating that, and the owner has been contacted, and the position is that they are okay with that nomination. So if you choose not to nominate it, then it just simply would end because there's no propensity of anybody pushing it other than your city as a whole has chosen this as a place. Does that help?
That does help.
Thank you.
'Cause I was under the impression that owners could request that they didn't have to go to the local body, they could go to the state for a recognition of a property regardless of what a municipality said.
Yeah. They can make that application, but if it goes by the agreement with the state and the federal where you already have a sanctioned group, then it has a much higher chance of being rejected.
Okay.
In that case, I move that we recommend Ron Randall's gas station, whatever the official name of it is, to the state for this National Register of Historic Places nomination.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. We recommend Ron's Phillips 66 Service Station for the National Register of Historic Places, passing on the landmarks application for that. Any further discussion on this? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. Next up, we have a public hearing on zoning code amendments related to hillside overlay lot widths. Corey, I imagine you would start us off with a staff report, and I believe the applicant is here, and we'll invite the applicant to speak if he would like to as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Members of the council, the request is a zone map amendment. The zone map amendment involves the hillside overlay, so this is not looking at the different zoning districts you have, it's just where an overlay sits in the foothills. There's additional development standards other than the base zoning because of that overlay, and they want to amend that overlay. The portion of the overlay is the lot width requirement. Stepping back a little bit, when you're dealing with hillsides, there are three categories of slopes. Anything under 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and there's different provisions in those slope areas. Anything over 30 is a no-touch regulation.
And is that our regulation or county or state?
That's ours. That's our specific overlay. We have, though, when you come to lot widths, there's kind of two sets. You have an agricultural zone lot width, which is an automatic 125-foot width, where the normal base zone would have been 80 feet. When you have, in the particular case of the applicant, they have a piece of property is in the RL zone, and that's base zoning is a 60-foot lot width. But once you hit above 10% in slope, the ordinance then kicks in and says everything's 100 feet, all the way up to 30. So it's 60 at the base zone, anything over 10% jumps up to 100 feet. And that's the struggle with the particular piece of property that the petitioner has. They can hit the 100-foot lot or close to the 100-foot lot width, but the effort to preserve the home creates these really funky lot lines. And so the issue is there's an ordinance that says we like perpendicular, straight, cookie-cutter lines. We have this that says, but it has to be 100 feet. He's looked at it and said, well, I'm just barely over this. I'm barely into this next category. So it seems like that if I'm just over 10%, I'm treated as somebody that's 29%. And so he provided a text amendment that ratioed for every 1% above, you raise it by 2 feet, all the way up to 30%, and submitted that to the city. We looked at it as a development review committee, and we understood the argument that if somebody is at 11%, that's different than somebody that's at 25%. We recognize that difference. And so the ratio was an idea of saying, yes, we think some equity or inequity here is potential. And our findings for reason why that inequity is we believe that the idea of increasing the lot width is important to preserve. So an example is if you are on a steeper hillside and you have 60-foot wide lots, everybody's going to be retaining each other's driveways just to get into their houses. And so a very narrow lot width is, creates that problem. And keep in mind, the hillside was created when we used to always be at 80 feet. And then the 2003 came in and said the RL reduces to 60 feet. So 60 feet was in our mind of on a slope can create those retaining problems. Our other argument, though, is that widening the lots and the market and the demand and the prices of housing here and all those other factors, and everybody from California, as we talked in work session, want to move here. Everybody likes it in Centerville. And if you get wide lots, you get multiple retaining systems again. In Ford Canyon, although Ford Canyon was exempt from the hillside, you see lots there that are 135, 125, 140 in Ford Canyon, and you see the multiple retaining systems. So what happens when you get too large of a lot, they can build a bigger home, they want to flatten out the yards, and they're making all kinds of retaining systems because they have much larger pieces of property. And that's not really the intent of the hillside either, is to cut and fill, cut and fill, cut and fill. You're trying to maintain most of the natural slope. So we said, yes, there's an inequity here of taking somebody that's barely over 10 and jumping you to 100 feet, but we're uncomfortable with the 2-foot increment, or 2-foot increment for percentages. So we asked the city engineer and the public works director as we discussed this, what is their experience, particularly Kevin, who is our engineering firm. And he said, well, we really have okay design standards and city specs, particularly when we're dealing with roadways. We allow up to 12% roadways as a standard. So now we're above 10%, and a 12% is considered satisfactory for a roadway. But after 15%, we have up to 15% for short distances. So now we're getting to areas that are more problematic, and that's why we cut off the roadway at 15%. And so he said, I'm willing to take that inequity we have identified and say, we can go the base zone to 10%, go to 80 feet, up to 15%, but after 15%, I still think the 100-foot and the problems with roads and so forth is where my recommendation would land. So we did not agree with the proposed changes, even though we agreed with the inequity. So our proposal to the commission was the base zone to 10%, 10% to 15%, 80 feet to handle the inequity, but still maintain above 15% to the 100-foot distance. Took that to the Planning Commission, and ultimately through their process, they sanctioned that idea and recommended it also. So the recommendation is to approve the amendment as modified by the Development Review Committee.
Thank you for that. Questions for staff before we hear from the applicant? I have one technical question. Could you clarify how this is measured? This is measured from the setback line, not from the property line. Can you just clarify where that is and how you measure this?
Yeah, there's a couple of provisions. You have a lot frontage width at the street, and so the best way to put an example is if you're doing a straight street, you just make these very rectangular square lots. If you have a cul-de-sac, when you reach the end of the cul-de-sac, it now has to fan out in a pie pattern of some fashion. And so what the code is trying to say is well, we like the straight lines, but we're going to have those instances where we're going to alter that, particularly like at the end of a cul-de-sac. At the street, we'll let you have like a 40-foot frontage right on the street and property line. But at your setback, where the home is supposed to be placed, we still want to maintain the base zoning standard of 60 feet wide. And the purpose of that is that that's the placement of the home, and that's where you get the side setback yards to the home that we're trying to maintain those distances. So at the street, sometimes we'll reduce it, but at setback, which at RL zone, setback's 25 feet. So at 25 feet, you have to hit this particular width under all circumstances.
Thanks for explaining that.
And is it at setback or at the position of the house?
At setback. The regulatory setback is what the hillside zone says. The house may end up being deeper for whatever reason, but the width is measured at the regulatory setback line.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, let's hear from the applicant if you'd like to say anything with Mr. Chad Morris, and then we'll open it up for public hearing.
Thank you, Chad Morris. I feel like Corey kind of hit it pretty well with that. There is just a great amount of inequity between different slopes. And in fact, the lot that I'm working on, I'm trying to create 3 lots in addition to the lot that the house is on. And 2 of those lots have an average slope of like 10.5, 10.9. So I've been trying to work this out with the Development Review Committee, and ultimately this is kind of the best situation to where I think it gives not only me the ability to create homes, but also allows for a pretty good sized lot because of that 80-foot frontage. But also I think what it does is, like Corey said, when you have 100-foot frontage, all of a sudden the price of the lot is generally going to be a lot higher because you have to now have more property in that lot, which generally means the value of the lot's going to go higher and the house is usually going to go higher, which I'm from Centerville, and so I recognize that, in Centerville on the hill, I think that's what's great about Centerville and Farmington and some of Bountiful, is that when you get into the hillside, you have those smaller homes. You don't have to have those gigantic homes like you have up in Eaglewood, which there's nothing wrong with those homes, but this allows variety between home. You're not going to just have those massively wide homes. And so I think this is good not only obviously for me, but and future, current home landowners up there, but also for residents in general that want to live here but may not be able to if it's kept at 100 feet. So.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Any questions for the applicant?
Thank you.
All right, this matter is scheduled for a public hearing, so I'll go ahead and open the public hearing and invite anyone who would like to comment on this proposal to change the lot width standards for development within the hillside overlay zone. Is there anyone who would like to speak? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and turn to the council for discussion and action.
So if action is taken on this in the affirmative, Steve, Corey, can this just be your standard bullet point for your letter on the 31st back to the state? I'm not joking, I'm serious.
That is a good.
Flexible standards.
Trying to give him something concrete to work with.
Any other questions or items of discussion? If not, I would look for a motion to follow the recommendation of staff, which would be to approve ordinance 2017-30, amending section 124240 of the zoning code regarding lot widths for development within the hillside overlay zone.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. We approve this ordinance 2017-30, changing the hillside overlay lot widths. Any further discussion?
I just want to make sure that I had one experience with a friend who thought he had a wide enough lot, and then in trying to create a driveway that he could get up in the winter, he got to buy width from the neighboring guy so that he could zigzag up the hill. So I'm glad to see that we're still keeping some of the 100 width. Thank you for that.
All right. Given this is an ordinance change, let's do this by roll call vote, starting with George.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. You're on your way. Thank you very much for that one. Next on our agenda is PDO zoning map amendment and conceptual plan for the Legacy Commons development. This was discussed last council meeting. Corey, do you want to provide any update in terms of a staff report?
Probably ought to make sure that they know what the new information is.
And I believe the developer is here. If we have questions, Mr. Spencer Wright is available to speak or comment.
Make sure I've got the right agenda item open. Okay, I will defer to the developer on some of the proposed changes to you and why they've made them. At your last meeting, in looking at this PDO overlay, they were responding. We had some communication with them to talk about what was identified by the council. As I recall, the meeting talked about the phasing plan. I think it was, if I recall right, you talked about suggesting greater commitment to establishing commercial of some type and before the residential takes place is one of the identified issues. I believe they're proposing that the hotel would be in phase 1, the residential would be 2, and the remaining commercial would be in a phase 3 construction. So he can explain to you what they've worked out with putting a hotel first. And I believe that you may have some questions about that. The other issue that came up with traffic, we do have a traffic study on the project already. We talked about the 2 dual access on 1250 West and the short distance to the 1, but the engineer felt like there could be a workable plan through that. They also had discussion that they had not given up hope on the Parish Lane access, and I know that brought up matters of safety and whether full access there or not was appropriate, and they talked about that we'd probably be a limited access, a ride-in.
It's up on there now.
Yeah. So if you look at get oriented here. If you look at Parish Lane, so this way's north, east towards the hills, they now show a conceptual idea. This is not approved by UDOT, but a conceptual idea of a ride-in for the hotel site. But they would then be limited to come back out around to the 1250 West site for an exit. That's not approved by UDOT. That still would be something that they would have to wrestle with UDOT and see if that's a possibility. But this proposal, if you accepted this site plan, that would be a potential to be allowed in this proposal. If UDOT never approved it, we would be back for full accesses only at 1250 West. I believe the other directive was to consider density changes. That was mentioned in our communication. This proposal, I believe, leaves it still at 111 units, which was, they started out at around 120 from your very first initial thought. They came to you officially with 111. I believe this plan maintains at 111. One small minor change to the site plan, this U-shaped set of residential is flipped, it's mirrored, so now you have the parking area near the commercial where the parking area used to be tucked behind. That was something I'd mentioned in the last meeting because I'd heard from their team that they'd like to do that. I don't think that's a significant change. I think it does a good job of buffering the front yards to their neighbors across the street and allows the parking to be a buffer, so I don't see that as a significant problem in the redesign of the site for that. They also updated to you, I believe, a hotel elevation conceptually. In the PDO, they have to provide preliminary ideas of their architecture. It doesn't mean it reflects the exact floor plan, but they're to stick to the thematic look that they're proposing. And they also added an update. So there's their hotel design. And then they also added an update to the commercial elevations. That I don't believe was in your last packet. You only saw the elevations of the residential. So depending on your decision tonight, what was recommended to you by the Planning Commission, this proposal tonight would modify that. So we would, if you were to proceed, you wouldn't want to mimic, unless you agree, exactly word for the Planning Commission's recommendation. If there are components of this you want to add in, you would have to amend that. So you'd update the layout to the project to your submittal tonight rather than the one that the commission was provided. You would update the elevations to the hotel and the commercial and add that in to the approval. Lisa asked me earlier, I just didn't have time in preparation for our work session to write up a change. Sorry, Lisa. So you'd have to update your elevation plans to match what has been provided to you tonight if you move forward with the project. Other than that, that's the summary I have for you.
Thank you, Corey. Questions for Corey before we hear from Mr. Wright? Mr. Spencer Wright, anything else you want to add or comment on the changes that you've suggested?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I appreciate the opportunity to be here again tonight. Yeah, I think Corey did a good job of kind of discussing some of those things that we talked about in our last meeting.
And Spencer, we need to get a bulb for that, but if you're just a little more distance away from it. And,
Got it.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Okay, sorry. Let's see, so yeah, with regards to the site plan, we just, on that main drive aisle coming into the project, we just kind of flip-flop the parking and the building. We think that's a better design. Yeah, with regards to the phasing, we were able to come to an agreement with the hotel that they would pull a building permit sometime in 2018. Their goal is to pull the permit in the first half of 2018, and so we have an agreement with the hotel to do that, and so we would commit that that would be the first building permit that would be pulled on the project. With regards to the density, so we've considered the request to reduce the density, and there's a couple of reasons why we haven't done that. First of all, we feel like with the density that we have, we can provide a better project. With this density, we have the ability to build, as shown on the site plan, a clubhouse that will have a fitness room. It will have a room, a kind of a meeting room that the residents can use for birthday parties and other things like that. It also allows us to provide a pool, a hot tub, and other amenities for the use of the residents that are not possible if we have a lower density. The second reason we think that this density is ideal for the project is that if you get too low of a density, then the maintenance can sometimes suffer. If you have enough density, then you have the ability to have a full-time person that's on site to help to provide maintenance and help things that come up with the residents. So we feel like with this density, we can provide that. We can have a full-time staff member who would be there full-time and could help with any problems or things that arise with the residents in their units. And I think maybe the last reason is the economic benefits. The economic benefits of this project to the city, I think, are good. I think they help the city to be able to have the revenue that they need to do additional things that can benefit the residents of the city, including parks and things like that. In conjunction with Mr. Thacker, we've looked at the numbers again, made a few tweaks, and also with our consultant, Randy Sant. We feel good about those numbers, and we think it's a good project for the city and its residents. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions for Mr. Wright? I certainly appreciate the efforts on the phasing plan. That gives me a lot more confidence that we're headed for a long-term successful project. Any updates on the other commercial properties, or have you not actively marketed those yet?
Yeah, we haven't. So we have our sign up on the property, and we're fielding calls. And we've had, I think I've mentioned in the past, we've had at least a half dozen calls of different types of users that are interested in locating on the property. And we've obviously just had to put everything on hold until we had the approval. But you know, we're confident that that will get done. As we've talked about in the past as well, all of the housing that we can create over here on the west side of the city will help to bring additional commercial as well. So that's another reason why a mixed-use project here we think is ideal to help support and bring additional commercial to this location.
Could I clarify something with Spencer and Corey? When you talk about phasing and drawing a permit for the hotel first, we probably need to clarify. You probably, however, want the ability to go forward with preparing the whole site in terms of site improvements. But I'm assuming what you're saying is that you would pull a hotel permit before you would pull a permit for the vertical construction of the residential.
Yes.
You would want the ability to go ahead with the site work, wouldn't you, for the whole site?
We would do the site work for the whole site in conjunction with the vertical construction. So we would do that at the same time. So
I'm just probing you because
Yeah.
I don't want this to be impractical either.
yeah, no, that's a good question, yeah.
Are you going
You've
to
got a lot
be?
of fill you need to do. You have a lot of overall site work,
Yes,
right?
yes, that's a good point. That's a fair point. I've been thinking about vertical construction and going vertical on the buildings.
So I'm asking Corey if there's a practical way
Yeah,
that
that's a
they
good-
could proceed with site work with not getting a permit for the residential vertical before they get a permit for the hotel, but have site work going on for the,
I think it's a great question. The way I'm viewing it and hearing it from the developer is they will pursue a final site plan approval and a two-lot subdivision at the same time. And so the subdivision work and the tying of laterals and the infrastructure will be potentially bonded with the subdivision approval, is what I'm assuming right now at this point in time. So the subdivision would take place to initiate the improvements, infrastructure to the two lots. The question becomes is once you get inside of those lots, when does the site work need to proceed? And what I'm hearing right now is that with the building permit with the hotel, they would be moving forward with all of the grading, removing of the debris, and cleaning up the property all at the same time is what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah, and to be honest, I haven't thought through that. It may be, that we would like to get in and do some of that site work ahead of time, but I hadn't considered that option. I didn't know if that was a possibility.
Because some site work will take place when you're extending those water through the project site and the easements that are associated there. That's a city bid project in partnership with you to make sure that that takes place. So there's some on-site prep work that has to take place just to
absolutely.
put infrastructure in.
Yeah.
And then the remaining area of the properties, the timing of that is up to you to decide.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think if it were permissible by the city, what we would propose is once we knew that the hotel was close, they had building plans submitted to the city, and they were in that review process and getting ready to pull that permit. Ideally, we could then pull a permit just for the site work and come in and start moving dirt, installing utilities. And so then by the time the hotel was actually ready to pull their permit for their construction on their site, we had those utilities to the pad, and then after they had pulled their building permit, then the other things could occur. So does that make sense? Does that
Yeah, I think what
is that
Steve was
clear
saying
as
is
mud,
that
or-
pulling a permit wouldn't be tied to, until the hotel pulls the permit, you can't put in the subdivision improvements. And they obviously have to go in, there's a lot of fill and concrete that needs to be removed to
Yeah.
even build the hotel,
Right.
let alone the rest of the project.
right.
Yeah.
So I talked to you earlier, Corey, and I was wondering, we talked about a way of, rather than having it say, pull the permit, that the hotel is started. Because my concern still is, I don't want them to pull the permit for the hotel, go ahead and start the residential, and then all of a sudden, the hotel permit's expired, and they've got their residential, and we still have a corner with nothing on it. So
Right.
do you have a suggestion for us that we could maybe change
Yeah,
this a
as
little
we
bit?
talked, I said we would have to explore with Spencer and gain their thoughts on the matter. From my point of view in a practical, if we have issued a permit and they've done all the structural, the engineering and everything for the hotel, that's a lot of investment to back away from and just pull a permit and go 180 days and expire.
Aren't you also paying impact fees at the time you pull a permit?
At the pulling the permit.
So that's a
But
significant-
given that they still haven't constructed and whatever happens, the talk with Spencer is when's the timing? As soon as they pour a footing, they're on their way, and it's not just impact fees now. They've mobilized their contractors, they're in place.
Yeah.
The likelihood of backing out then is the perfect storm that whatever happens
Sure,
in the economic market. So I did say that we would discuss, the conversation of is pulling a permit, when do we want to feel comfortable that the hotel is actually committed to the work?
Yeah, and that's a fair point. We're not here to try to trick anyone or do it.
And I'm not accusing you
No,
of that.
and I
mean,
I
I just know
you're not.
economy does.
Sure, yeah. So that's totally fair, and we would be willing to commit to you, and however you want to do that would be fine, but we would be willing to commit that we wouldn't start construction until they had poured foundations or something, because, yeah, we understand what the intent is, and we will live by that.
Another question, this might be for Corey, but you mentioned a two-lot subdivision.
Yeah,
You will keep the commercial with all the residential in one lot, or would you?
correct.
Wouldn't we be a three-lot subdivision? And will that come back to the city council as all subdivisions do for approval?
Two-lot would stay at the small subdivision waiver and would happen as part of the site plan. If they went to a three-lot, then that would be returned to the council.
Yeah, and we're just proposing a two-lot because we do anticipate retaining ownership of the commercial, not selling it off. And the hotel, they have insisted that they wanted to purchase that property, so that's why it would be a two-lot. But
So-
we would retain ownership, and our intent is to keep ownership of all of that and not to sell it.
So the two lots is the hotel.
And the rest.
And then the commercial and the residential.
Yeah, the hotel and everything else, yep.
Well, if you're looking at it, I mean, that's an incentive that whoever's purchasing or keeping the residential is constructed tied to the commercial has got a lot of land that they don't want sitting.
So the PDO, if adopted, is applicable regardless of the subdivision?
Correct.
So, okay.
Everything underneath it, site plan subdivisions will all be tied to the PDO approval.
Totally non sequitur. What's the work that's going on down there right now? Is that drainage for the commercial park to the north?
It's the high-pressure gas line from Dominion Energy is the proper name right now. Old Questar, but it's the high-pressure gas
It's
line.
the one that we thought was going to go down 1250 West and...
Yeah, to the Yanks dispenser, it's traversing right through the middle of this project.
Yeah, and they have an easement there. We've known about it forever, but we were hoping that Dominion and the city could work it out so it would be in 1250. But
Where does that
tried.
come through there?
So if you look at the Fred Hale project, this is the corner where the dog park is, and that easement goes right here. So you see it's just off the hotel, right in between those buildings. And right now, they've got a big trench in the public works yard, and everybody's really happy about that.
Turnabout's fair play, I guess.
Other questions?
I don't like it. You knew I'd say that. It wouldn't be me if I didn't say it.
No.
I understand the role of economy, and I understand the desire to have somebody full-time, but I don't think it's long-term in Centerville's best interest to have 111 or whatever units down there. I think that the demand that residential creates for the city over the long haul is more than what the project is benefiting us. Yes, it pretties up a place that looks bad now, but I think at some point we need to not cut off our nose to spite our face. I'm very disappointed that you didn't change the density at all. I'm very
I
disappointed.
understand.
And that's a sticking point with me. It'll be a no.
Other comments or questions?
Can we go to the actual ordinance text, page 3, paragraph E? Can you put that up, Jake?
Page 3.
Page 3, paragraph E, section 2. So as the current, it says that it shall be prepared as what development site to support development in its entirety. To your question or concern, Robin, if this were reworded to match the current proposal from the developer so that it's actually reading phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, does that change anything for you
I
necessarily?
think that would be more helpful.
And Lisa, do you have specific recommended language? We have the language in Mr. Wright's email, but
Yeah, I would probably suggest that if the council's inclined to make a motion to approve this, that it be approved, but direct staff to update the conditions to reflect the applicant's submittals, including the conceptual plan, update the elevations for the hotel and the commercial, and also addressing the phasing, which Councilmember McEwen has pointed out in subsection E. And I think to allow staff to work through that, but essentially it would be phase 1 is the hotel, phase 2 is the residential, and phase 3 is the commercial. I don't think there's an issue with phase 2 coming before phase, or phase 3 coming before phase 2, because you do want the commercial and you want the hotel, but I would suggest just adding language that said that that a building permit must be obtained and a foundation poured for the hotel, i.e. phase 1, before any building permit can be granted for any residential units. And I think you've raised some good points that yes, I mean, my concern was just pulling a building permit or getting a building permit doesn't guarantee that it's going to be constructed, but I think there's good arguments that they would have to have quite a bit of outlay of expenses to support a good faith effort to obtain that building permit, pay all their fees. And I think if the applicant is willing to add in that the foundation will actually be poured, then, you know, that's a.
you're not turning back in.
Yeah.
So that would be my suggestion, but I still think that there's a couple things that staff would like to work out. If the revisions are acceptable, then we'll go in and make those changes to the exhibits and double check all the conditions.
Well, to Steve's comment there, that's why I'm looking at the specific areas where it says shall be prepared to support development in its entirety, and then the phasing says construction activities. This is all down to definitions, Lisa, you know how much fun we've had with these lately. Is that going to allow for what Steve is suggesting, just to make sure they recognize the economies of scale for site prep?
We have had far more detailed phasing plans than this. This is really not a plan, it's just saying, I'll build the hotel first. So you could direct staff to say we want a little bit more detail on the phasing plan. But I do agree with Mr. Snyder that if they're going to subdivide and they also need final site plan, that's when we determine when all the public improvements are going to go in. So for Legacy Crossing, we were very specific with what public improvements had to go in with what phase. But for this project, since it's so small, I think staff was anticipating and hoping that they are going to put in all the public improvements at the same time and/or with subdivision. I mean, that's what we say is typically when you subdivide, you have to put in all the public improvements. So I think it's probably something we have to put a little bit more thought in, but you know, even with a final site plan, you can go ahead and do site work on phase 1, I mean, in my opinion, because you're putting in all of those subdivision improvements. But each phase, and this is actually ordinance provision, each phase of a development has to stand on its own. So you couldn't just come in and do the hotel and stop. You have to do the hotel where it could stand on its own, or, well, we plan for it, you know, with the residential, so.
Meaning, for example, you'd have to have access out to 1250 West.
Exactly, yes. You'd have to put in enough
sidewalks.
improvements so that if the rest of the development did not come through, then it could stand on its own. But, you know, and maybe we can add something here that, you know, to that effect. But I don't know the developer's plans on when they want the residential to come in, but it certainly could be fleshed out more. This isn't really a phasing plan, it's just a 1, 2, 3, and the hotel will come first. It's not really addressing the public improvements But I think we've acknowledged it's a pretty small project in the scheme of things. I mean, it's not quite as complicated as Legacy Crossing.
Lisa, you mentioned you had some other suggested changes. Do you want to share those with us, or they're not substantial enough to share?
No, I just want to make sure from just looking at what's been proposed, it seems to me that we have to update the concept plan, but then they also had the utility and other plans that have not been updated. And I don't know if the hotel elevations, if we want to add some language of, you know, it's got to look like this, because we don't make reference, I don't think, to the hotel elevations. So just minor things like that to make sure that our conditions line up with what's been proposed.
That is a good point, because we've had problems in the past where developers have come and shown us something that looks very nice in an illustration, and then the product that's built
Yeah.
does not match the illustration.
So right now it
very
says the
well.
design of the hotel and commercial uses shall be subject to the Parish Lane Design Guideline, you know, and standards, but really, do we want to say the design of the hotel shall look like Exhibit B? Or the design of the commercial shall look like Exhibit B, so,
I'm seeing a lot of nodding out there, so that's what you're suggesting?
Yeah, the thing that we're trying to keep in place is there, at the bottom of the conditions, you're granting specific variations to the Parish Lane Design Guidelines. We're just saying that the rest of the internal stuff with landscaping and all stay in place, the screening. The issue will be is that if they've submitted hotel plans now, so we just need a condition that says the elevation, the thematic elevation, this is a thematic elevation and expectation of the hotel. And so they'll work out the floor plan, so there'll be subtle changes, but this is the design that the commission will be looking at for compliance with the PDO.
yeah, and I mean, the important thing is that as a PDO, this is a legislative decision, so this is your shot at the apple.
Right.
So if you really like the way the hotel looks, then we need to put it in these conditions that we want the hotel to look like that. If they want to change that, they can, they'd have to come back and get an amendment. But basically, we want to put in as much detail of what you like.
Yeah, because your Parish Lane Design Guidelines will, if you don't put the hotel and the commercial in, then the Parish Lane Design Guidelines drive that look.
So, and what about for the residential units? I mean,
That theme has already been established with the PDO.
and
Yeah, and they didn't actually
you're comfortable-
change-
You're comfortable with that?
Yeah,
Yes.
they didn't change any submittals on the residential, so
No.
what the design that, we do have that in the exhibits, it's just what they've changed that hasn't been addressed.
And that covers the building materials as well as, or just the thematic look?
On the slate of the residential, they have the sampling of the materials in their graphics.
And that becomes part of
Yeah.
the PDO?
Right.
But not the hotel.
The hotel doesn't have a sampling. You're just seeing the design elevation in a theme and the commercial in a design elevation and theme. If you like those, add those to be part of the design of the Parish Lane. If not, you're saying the Parish Lane Design Guidelines rule the materials. But in my opinion, either one are going to get you where you want to be. It's just whether you want this exact design.
My preference, if the council is willing, would be to add those. We decided not to do a development agreement, thinking we could still get the same results with this. It seems like we ought to.
I'm
Cover our
still
bases.
very hesitant on the entry in from Parish.
Yeah, what, obviously, if UDOT says no to that, then,
Well, that's easy, but Lisa just said this is your bite at the apple.
Yeah, so so the example is if UDOT is convinced to the right end, if you pass it this way, then the right end can take place. And if you're uncomfortable with that,
But then if it doesn't, do they have to come back to us?
No.
No.
and what about, so the right end, if you can put that picture back up, you show basically a deceleration lane
Correct.
before the turn-in, as opposed to just a
Correct.
turn-in, which, in my opinion, would make it,
Cause more trouble.
well, be safer than just a turn-in with no
Yeah,
deceleration.
absolutely. Yeah, that design should not have any impact traffic-wise, other than it would reduce the amount of left turns from 1250 West
Right.
headed north, which is actually a really good thing. So it would, overall traffic-wise, a traffic engineer would say, that's awesome. They would say, that's a great idea. I mean, if the hotel would prefer it, I think it would be better for a lot of reasons, but if the city says we don't want it, I mean, we won't do it. We just think it's the right thing to do, but.
And it seems, in my opinion, it seems like it would improve the economic viability of the hotel and,
Yeah.
and the development.
Yeah, and I think
If
it's
it
better
can
for
still
traffic,
be
too.
within the safety.
And you
Right.
could also be very clear and just say, this conceptual plan layout is approved with or without the right turn lane off of Parish for the hotel. Then that's very clear that it doesn't have to be built exactly to the conceptual. You're okay if they put that in or they don't.
Could you also say it's approved with, subject to the approval by UDOT?
So here's my issue with it. Just as you're creating a deceleration before you're entering, okay. You have a northbound entry, right, onto Legacy that you're creating a deceleration right in the middle of. That ends going northbound, right? Can you do an overlay, Jake, just a quick Google Maps there with the satellite view?
Well, is the deceleration lane a lane that's not there right now?
No, there are two lanes there. So one will take you
But do they
southbound, the
take,
other will take you
do they
north.
take a slice out of their property
Yes,
to create
that's-
the deceleration
That's
lane?
correct. So if you were gonna go into the project, you're gonna move over. You're gonna move over out of the way
So it's gonna
into this
become,
other lane, and that's when you start to slow down. That's how it would be designed.
so it's gonna become 3 lanes, not 2.
Right.
And that would be on your property that you're actually
Correct.
putting that.
That's
So can you
correct.
make it just a little bit larger? So what I'm saying there is, okay, too bad we don't have 2 screens, but if you see where that deceleration is going to take place, you're now coming in, you're interrupting traffic flow headed southbound potentially because you're now slowing down going into you're coming out of the intersection.
Here?
No, it's right down Parish. So if the entry point's there, you're in the north lane, you're now slowing down traffic trying to go around onto the Legacy.
Well, but that,
they're not
but you've
the
moved
dec-
into a deceleration lane.
I get that.
And that
but-
traffic should be slowing down anyway to make the turn. It's only a 35-mile-an-hour road. and
Yeah, it's
suppo-
35 miles an hour unless one of our officers is not currently present, then it's a little faster than that. But I guess that I may be alone on this one, but hunting for hotel entrances, having done it many times in areas I'm not familiar with, I tend to drive slower when I'm looking for the entrance to a hotel. That just, to me, that would just be a problem. But again, I may be lone voice on that. I just don't want to interrupt what is pretty good traffic flow through there. Forcing them to make a right turn and a left, yeah, that's annoying too.
And I think my concern is you'll see the hotel and people will turn on Parish trying to get to it, and then there won't be an entrance, and they'll be wandering around trying to find the entrance to that, resulting sometimes in maybe more dangerous traffic than if there just was an entrance. But we're speculating, we're not the professionals.
Fortunately, I think we have a
traffic-
professional out there who's a member of staff.
There was
I would love to hear the chief's perspective on that. I could be totally up in the night. I mean, I don't watch traffic all day.
Well, let me, while he's coming up, let me make the point or play off of what somebody just said. If they miss where they think the hotel entrance is and there isn't one, they're going to have to do a U-turn on Parish.
Well, I don't want them doing a U-turn on. If they miss it, they're going to be on there as well.
Right. The concept that I'm looking at here, I actually don't have a problem with the deceleration lane.
Put the concept back. Just a second, we'll get it back up to the chief.
And a lot of that has to do with the comment that was made about making that left-hand turn once they get on to 1250 West. I'd rather see them not be making that left-hand turn there on 1250 West. Once they get on to 1250 and going north, making a left-hand turn into that first entrance. I'm a little bit concerned about that entrance in between 500 North and Parish, just because it's so close. There's not much distance there. But I'm thinking that if we can keep most of the traffic from that particular, there's a little stick here.
That's right.
From this particular ingress, if we can keep most of the traffic making a right-hand turn out of there and not have as many left-hand turns in, I don't think it's going to have as much impact on what's going on 1250 West here. With this deceleration lane here, I'm actually okay with that as far as making an entry into the hotel there. And I do have that same concern if they come down here and they miss an entrance, that they would go down to the bottom of Parish Lane and do a U-turn. And that could create us a problem as well. So I'm okay with that design.
Thanks for your impromptu request.
Corey, do I remember hearing that there was a traffic study's already been done on this? Was there any findings from that that's council should be aware of?
Just the debate that occurred. They had A-Trans, and A-Trans supports this with some signing and some other things that go on with that exit, the closer exit to 1250, closer to Parish.
I think that's
yeah.
far enough away.
Kevin's a little uncomfortable with just the signing. He wants to explore with the traffic engineer. There's discussion of how to control a ride in and ride out there. Also, there's also discussion on how some lane striping can happen, because Kevin is concerned, the same with the chief, indicating that a lot of left-hand turns, and we know that those left-hand turns are going to be peak. It's not all day long. It's a peak. And Kevin's just he believes a solution can be achieved. He just says, I don't want to say it's only this way in the traffic study. But the traffic study did conclude that it's workable. Now we just have to come up and say, well, it's workable, but it's not our preferred route. So how could we modify it in some manner with some striping, measuring the distance? Because that's what happened on the Maverick. We changed those islands around the roundabout to create some more stacking. And that's just what Kevin wants to further work with their traffic engineer, is get as much movement of traffic as we can. So he felt like his recommendation at the DRC was, I believe this is workable. We'll just have to hammer it out at site plan.
Are you saying, Corey, that one of the possibilities is that first entrance on 1250 West would be when it coming out, it'd be a right only?
Right.
Okay.
And then move others to the left to go to the 500. That's not necessarily the developer's preferred, because they're trying to market to commercial and sell that. But all in all, Kevin did say, I think at site plan we can figure this out.
Other questions or concerns or things you want to include in a motion to modify?
Spencer, I just had a question along with Stephanie. I'm still a little concerned about the density. Do you see any, I understand the things you told us tonight. They all make perfect sense. I'd still like to see it a little bit less. Do you see any way of being able to maybe do it just a
Sorry, any way of?
Any way of getting the density down a little bit?
So I think, of course, there's always a way to build less density, but in our opinion, we think it makes the project worse, not better, because of those reasons that I explained. So it's not a question of whether it can be done, it's a question of what's best.
I'm wondering with your project if you feel like there's some way without.
I really don't, not without having to sacrifice some of those other things that I mentioned. I think that it would impact those other things and ultimately make the project worse for the residents, in our opinion.
All right, council, what do you want to do on this one? I think that this is good for the overall area, because I think while this might not be my preferred development if I was choosing, I think the hotel and commercial actually will enhance the megaplex Legacy Crossing development, overall. It will probably speed up development of other properties in that general area. We've been There's a couple more lots that need to be, they've been waiting to develop there, and I think this brings overall economic viability to the area.
What is your ideal development? Since you said it's not your ideal, what is the
Well,
ideal development?
I'd love to have some office buildings, and
Okay.
nobody complains about that, right? Not that we need more dentists, but you know, Class A office space, you don't hear any complaints about that. It's, you know, very little impact on resources for Class A office space, but if Class A office space is not viable, I think this is one of the potentially acceptable alternatives. So I'm not able to make a motion on this.
Well, I'm just waiting to hear what other discussion
Yeah, is there
there is
other-
on.
I already made mine.
I had one point, it
comment,
was
so-
well refuted, so I'm good with that.
Where's Tammy when we need her?
Bill, what are your thoughts?
I would, I'm kind of with Stephanie and Robin, and yet I would, on the other hand, I would like to see the development happen and something happen. I would vote for it a whole lot quicker at 100 units than I would at 111. I think that's the number. It's probably not my place or even our place to wonder about the economics of 100 units rather than 111 units. I'm not asking, or I'm not thinking about 75. I'm thinking about shaving a little bit. I still have a sour taste in my mouth from the infamous Afoka property and the concentration. So I guess overall, I would be willing to make a motion to approve. Where's the number?
Ordinance
2017-29.
29.
2017-29, subject to the revisions that we have talked about with Lisa to be implemented by staff.
Specifically, the
to
updated,
ensure
updated site plan,
updated
elevations
site plan,
for hotel
elevations
and
for the hotel,
commercial, and a phasing plan.
And the phasing plan and the turn-in, if possible, subject to UDOT restrictions. But I'm just barely making it because I'd like to see it be a little lower, but I am going to make it.
Well, I'm going to second that motion, and to the 100 versus 111, I'm not sure that we move the needle much from, I mean, I don't think we're going to move, we're not going to notice 11 more apartments as far as that goes, but from a development standpoint, I can see that being a pretty major economic driver when you get to the end of where your margins are. Like I mentioned last time, now that I hear the Class A office space, great idea, I just don't know when or if that would ever come. And reasonably, if they're going to make something that's economically viable, somewhat consistent with what's down there already, which is, you know, got some density component to it, I mean, it fits. As much as I am not in favor of a ton of density either, I just don't see something else that drops in right there that fits differently. Unless it were a Class A or some sort of dealership or something else, which I don't think people would necessarily want a huge, well-lit car dealership down on that corner or otherwise. I don't know. I don't have a more specific, this is better.
So we have a motion and a second. Further discussion. I don't think we have a lot of further discussion. So if there's no further discussion, let's vote on the motion on the table, which is to approve ordinance 2017-29 with the revisions referred to updated site plan, elevations, phasing plan as recommended by staff. So those in favor, let's do a roll call vote, starting with George.
First on the spot. Okay, fair enough. I'll vote aye.
Robin?
See, I feel like 10 could make a difference. The traffic and everything is so bad down there. Aye.
Nay.
Aye.
That passes 3-1. So you're on your way. We've got a lot of work to do.
And if you should come in with a few less, we'll be all right with that. Remember, we've tried really hard to work with you, so in my opinion, 3 or 4 makes a difference, so what it's worth.
Yeah, and to be honest, there's a reasonable likelihood that it will be less. It may get reduced.
That would have made it a lot less painful for Robin if you said that.
Or even to say it up front so that it looked like you had made a good faith effort on what we asked for last time.
Likelihood, but didn't commit to, right?
Thank you very much. We look forward to more updates on this.
So when Tammy says we don't say yes to anything, will somebody please remind her we said yes to 2 things in a row?
That is true. I will note that. We got 2 more things on the list. So next up, next item on our agenda is proposed zoning code amendment again. This is regarding definitions in the table of uses for catering limited in the commercial medium zone. Who is taking this one? Cassie?
Do you still need me to say anything? Have you?
Have there
It's
been
always good
changes
to
since
have
our
you.
last discussion?
I'm aware of at least one change of information that I discussed with another member of the council that was provided by Lisa that I think is germane.
I think that's worth discussing.
So if you don't know what that is, we can ask Lisa because I just vaguely know.
Yeah, I don't have the proposed definition in front of me if Lisa wants to read that.
Sure. The council has before you a new definition for catering limited, which is proposed as a conditional use in the commercial medium zone only at this time. And I was contacted by Councilmember Meekum to perhaps come up with some language to address some council and neighborhood concerns about potential smells emanating from this type of use. So we do have a history in this area of restaurants, fast food. We had a Domino's Pizza and a Chinese restaurant that the neighborhood could smell the food source quite a bit. So I did some research on regulating smell, which is really interesting research.
That's why you're paid the big bucks.
In my opinion, local government, and we have authority through zoning regulations and public health and safety to regulate light. We have a lot of night sky ordinances. We also regulate noise, which is also has a few more objective criteria, but in my opinion, smell is similar to light and sound, and it's something that we can regulate. It's difficult to come up with some regulations, given it was an EPA study that I had researched. They had done a 50-state analysis on how government regulates odors and smell. It was more on a pollution control, but also odor and pollution, and whether it was a public health and safety issue. And basically they said that smell is fairly subjective and it's not high on the list of public safety. But again, even with zoning, we can regulate for aesthetics. So in my opinion, we can regulate for lack of smell. So in an effort to assist the council in trying to add more uses in our commercial medium zone. I think we can add an additional sentence with the intent, by definition, not trying to create a nuisance or saying, you know, what's undesirable, but just saying, look, you can't really emanate or disseminate any smell beyond the boundaries of your property. So you really, before you make a decision to put this use here, you need to know that you're not going to be a smell-producing type of Domino's pizza, or perhaps even a bakery or that type of thing. So the sentence that is proposed, again, as a definition, would be to add this to the end of your definition, that this use, catering limited, is intended to be a low-intensity use permissible in commercial areas commonly located adjacent to residential uses, and shall prohibit the off-site dissemination of any detectable ambient food source odors. So I'm not, number one, again, it's a definition. It's not regulating nuisance, which I think gives us a leg up. I've put in some language there as to what our intent is by saying this is a low intensity use and it is going to be next to residential, and that's why we're taking this extra step to regulate smell and odors. And then just so we don't have to decide whether it's desirable or not, you just can't have really any detectable food source odors. Now that might be where someone challenges and says, well, that's not really fair because you're restricting this use even more than residential, which can have a barbecue grill in the backyard and all of that. But I think this is a good place to start. And
they probably don't barbecue 8 hours a day,
yeah,
7
exactly,
days a week.
with a commercial use. So again, it's limiting it, and I think that hopefully it's legally supportable given the research that I've done.
That is not in the verbiage we have.
That's not in the proposed ordinance right now. So you would have to say, we approve that ordinance subject to adding a condition that we add that language regarding restriction on odors.
Okay. I have one other question. Why is the reason this is only permitted in commercial medium that catering is also already approved in commercial high, and therefore it's kind of redundant and not?
Corey and Cassie might want to answer that, but I think my recollection is that this is an applicant-driven application, and so we wanted to stick to what they were asking for. We may want to go back in and allow it in other zones, but sometimes an applicant-driven application, if we add too much, it can get out of control, and then they have an application that they weren't even asking for. So we're just trying to be responsive to that request.
Okay, that's fine.
My question is, it says we're limiting the number of trucks, but are we limiting delivery trucks or times of delivery trucks? Are we going to have, not just with them. I have to say, you did a great job for yourself last time, because I was a definite no on this, and I've worked a lot with the city attorney and with our community development to try and get this to work, but still be a good thing for the neighborhood too. But I am concerned about others in the area. Are we able to control times of delivery trucks? Are we keeping that for ourselves? Do we have that?
Yeah, so in the definition, it does state that there would be a limited number of trucks, and I did keep that vague because that's obviously going to differ based on just the size of the tenant space and the capacity of the tenant. And in the CUP, in the conditional use process, there is a more thorough discussion of delivery trucks and parking and traffic flow and, even odors and pollutants and that kind of stuff that's can be quite an exhaustive list on the conditions of approval during the conditional use permit process that happens at the Planning Commission. So most of those things that you mentioned would all be determined and discussed at the conditional use permit process.
Okay. But that's at the Planning Commission, not at the council.
It is. And to respond to the new added definition additions here, I personally don't know about the health department, how that works to put those odor filters and how feasible or realistic that is for the tenants. So I really can't speak to that, and maybe the applicant can speak to how realistic that is. But from a staff perspective, it might be a little bit awkward of an enforcement issue, because if anyone were to complain, I would literally have to go sniffing around their building. But, you know, that's really the only way that we could do that.
I don't know that you would get a complaint if you have to sniff around their building, but if you drive through the neighborhood and you can smell it.
Sure,
Right, if you're
yeah.
2 blocks away
Yeah.
with your windows closed because it smells like, you know, orange chicken all night long, then that's the different situation. And that's really what was happening.
Yeah, and that was what was happening. When Domino's was there and when the Chinese restaurant was there, the smell was 2-3 blocks away, and it was permanent all the time.
Yeah.
People could not go out on their patios without smelling Chinese food.
Cassie, did you comment on whether catering is allowed in other commercial zones?
Sure, it's not, because it was not even in our table of uses prior to this proposal. So the applicant saw that it was not even an option to be anywhere. And the Planning Commission recommended that if this were to be approved, that we go back and take a look at it and further in our table of uses and put it as a permitted or a conditional use in other zones as well.
By way of discussion, I have one other concern with this, and that is that we are kind of tiptoeing into the process of what's going on in Main Street in the commercial zone, which overall, I don't think is a good idea. I'm actually sympathetic to and leaning towards voting in favor of this if it's brought up, because of some of the conditions. But I do have that serious concern, and I'm just putting that out there for people to know.
I think it's fair. This was brought by an applicant, so it's not the council trying to tiptoe around. Our job as a city council is to respond to applications that are brought to the council. So you're doing your job, but understand there's a larger effort on this, and I think it's fair. We're scheduled next week to meet with the Planning Commission again to talk about Main Street design guidelines, and table of uses is certainly a topic to discuss with the Planning Commission in general.
And as we talked about last time, the issue of uniqueness of Main Street, if it really is unique and there is a master plan into the future of how to maintain that uniqueness, then piecemealing it right now is a very bad idea.
That's right.
If it's not unique, then it's not as critical. I still think that's really what it boils down to in terms of the decision process here.
So the application on the table is to allow catering limited. The recommendation from staff is to approve this, and I think the suggested language from Lisa is a good idea. It's certainly a good addition to it. Council, what would you like to do? Is there a motion to approve this zoning code amendment?
I move that we approve ordinance number, is it 2017-27?
Correct, yes.
With Lisa's additional language.
I'll second that motion.
So moved and second, we approve ordinance 2017-27, which would add catering limited to the table of uses in the commercial medium zone with the changes as suggested by the city attorney, prohibiting ambient off-site odors. We'll use her language, not mine. George seconded. Further discussion on this issue?
My only concern about the addition, which I'm agreeing because the conditions put in there, but I'm really concerned that we're going to have, say, a bakery come in and say that you've created an artificial barrier to entry because I can't mitigate my cinnamon roll smell. You know, it's a concern.
Now, we
But-
do complaint-based enforcement, so if anyone complains about
They may or may
Centerville's-
not. I'm just
I've never heard that complaint, but it could be.
going to the other end.
Yeah.
Speaking of going to the other end, let's start the voting this time with Bill.
Aye.
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 That passes unanimously. Let me know where I can get my cup pop. Now we have to,
You keep saying we don't do any yeses, that's our thing.
now we have to talk about where we can eat this in Centerville. That's right. You can prepare it here, we just got to figure
But
out
not in
somewhere
that
we can eat
parking
it.
lot, that's for sure.
Anywhere in the parking lot. Someone who invites us, you can come over to.
All right, well, we will hope you will reserve, we have movies in the park in the summer, and we've had food trucks.
For the last couple of years, and we'll be there again.
All right, it'll be a short drive. Thank you. All right, we're making good progress. We got 3 of the big 5 items on the agenda.
Oh, we're not even half an hour behind.
Next up is a public hearing, general plan amendments, Neighborhood 1, Southeast Centerville, Pages Lane Commercial Area. This is has been tabled from October 3rd to consider the general plan amendments around in Southeast Centerville, particularly the Pages Lane Commercial area that's been discussed for some time. Corey, do you want to start us off with a staff report? And I believe we have applicant here or we have the public here to comment. This was not an applicant-driven initiative. It was driven by staff, but we had a proposal that came in the middle of this process that we've been responding to.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor and Council. Just as a gee whiz, I hear pt1 is the place for cinnamon rolls. Just if you ever know, there's a big sign there advertising their cinnamon rolls.
Oh, yeah?
I'm not sure how exactly, I'm going to leave it a little bit to the council to drive the discussion. The Planning Commission made a recommendation to you that you've reviewed, and part of that proposal was looking at particularly the east side. It included a couple of alternatives, considering a meaningful park is the term that was used. If a meaningful park doesn't take place, then convert it to residential and see if there's a partnership for some type of green space area buffering the west commercial from the east residential. During that process, you had a group of property owners, major interest in the Pages Lane East, and come to you and talk about an option of looking at a park proposal to that. I would prefer that they address their proposal because this is driven by them, so I would prefer that staff doesn't take a position in the sense of describing the proposal. But we certainly afterwards could give you our responses. We provided them in writing. It's a 2-part. I've given you some planning perspective. So after you hear the proposal, I'm assuming that you might entertain their comments first. I'd be happy to discuss their proposal from the land use pattern standpoint. But I think that land use pattern standpoint is not the primary driver in of itself. It's shared in a partnership of understanding the numbers and feasibility of their proposal in the city as a partnership in that, and the capacity for us to potentially look at that. So at this point, what's your wishes? Do you want to hear from the property owner and their letter and their reasoning so you can dialogue? Do you simply want us to jump right ahead, just give you the meat of our issues before you hear that? I'm open to which way you'd like to broach the situation.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear from the applicant at some point, if we'd like to. At some point, I'd like to, your recommendation is to amend your previous recommendation. That was, you had 2 options.
Yeah, I'm amending the Planning Commission's recommendations.
And I'd like to understand that at some point.
Yeah, I'm open to do it now or later, whatever you'd like.
Yeah,
I'm going to let you drive the discussion.
As much as we can have before the public hearing, so that if they have comments, concerns.
And I'm not clear on the agenda. It was advertised as a public hearing, and I think we agreed to continue it, but we didn't.
I was confused. I thought we tabled action, but I didn't know that we continued the public hearing, so
It's
maybe
on
I'm
there, and I don't have a
confused.
problem with it, but I thought all we did was.
It's
table
noticed,
action.
I'm okay
So I
with
think-
it, but.
I don't think we need, but let's hold a courtesy public hearing anyway, just because it
Sure.
was whether it was
advertised that way.
inadvertently advertised or not.
I think it was continued, the public hearing.
Okay.
But Corey, so would you explain your recommendation, or the modified recommendation? of the Planning Commission first.
The Planning Commission, again, they've bifurcated the property. The west is generally commercial. I know I've had discussion with Councilmember Meekum on the issue of what that west commercial is. It's basically assuming that the west is a viable commercial area, and that for the future, as that changes, consider options for mixed use. There's two elements to that. Either return, an idea of to go back and return to the Main Street overlay, which is interesting because we're looking at potential alternatives of the Main Street overlay. So that's an interesting intersect that wasn't planned, I don't think. That wasn't by me. Or if that alternative of the overlay doesn't work, look at another type of commercial mixed-use option. So that remains intact in the staff's recommendation to you. It's just simply forwarding the commission's version of the recommendation and leaving that intact. The eastern half, the commission's holistically recommended a residential redevelopment pattern at 8 units an acre. That's what their recommendation to you is. They did have 2 scenarios tucked inside of that conversion. The first one is to explore a meaningful city park, as we call it the A scenario option. If you have completed that at some point in time, then resort to the B option, whatever that decision of A happens into the future. Then the B option would be is maybe couple in partnership with the residential open space that's likely required because of the multifamily density, and use that part of their open space and partner with them in a program that would use that open space to buffer the commercial to the west and allow some public use of a portion of their open space in the residential project. And that was the 2 options of the commission. My recommendation at this point in time is the feasibility of the park is on the table already, so it's not something we're considering into the future unless there's a different park alternative you're thinking about, so I don't want to insult you. But at this point in time, it's my view of the data and the information that you are studying a meaningful park. So scenario A is a place that could drop off immediately if you either go for the park or you eliminate the park. And so now you're back to the alternative B, move forward with residential conversion and use the open space as a buffer and a public partnership. So I'm basically saying the decision on the park would happen now, and whatever that decision is, you move out. Now, just to put the cart before the horse in my mind, the feasibility of the park doesn't seem to be there from the data. And setting the feasibility of the park aside, because maybe you'll commit to that, I'm uncomfortable with the residential pattern of you've got a major commercial component to the west, you're leaving a significant component of commercial to the east for the time being, because their proposal would be to attrition that over time, but there's a length of time and leases and redevelopment would take place on that existing commercial on 400 East. And I am uncomfortable in a land use pattern tucking in adaptive reuse and a small segment of residential tucked into the back. I think that's a mistake. I think if we want to move forward with conversion of residential, it should be more significant than the commitment I see on the proposal. But I also have to acknowledge that that's tainted also with the bias that the park is unlikely. And that even worsens the situation for me. So that's my recommendation.
Thanks. Council, we have a couple options. We can discuss this first, and then I think we should hold a courtesy public hearing, or I'd suggest that we hold a courtesy public hearing now. I'd love to hear from a representative of DIKA Properties, and then turn it to the council for discussion.
I'd prefer to go that way.
Okay. I'll go ahead and open or continue the public hearing from last time. We'd love to take comments. If a representative from DIK would like to speak, we'd appreciate that.
Mayor, Council, thank you very much. For the record, Buck Swaney, representing DIKA Properties. And I understand that you've all had a chance to carefully review and read the proposal, as it was presented. It's falling away from me. And understand the basic concept that was offered. The property owner put together an approach that would subsidize the cost of that park, use a partial exchange of the park fees to help a little bit with that, but to try to put that core space in public ownership and address what we thought was really the core interest of the public as you ran your process. As we made the full circle on that, I'm not sure that we got to it feels, I think, a little bit to the property owners like the outcome was fairly quick and dramatic in terms of coming to a point where the staff altogether didn't support this. Again, because the adaptive reuse and the time it's going to take one way or another for this project, it's got a few years attached to it. We can do the adaptive reuse and we can do the apartment complex fairly quickly, but if really the adaptive reuse is the core question there, and the staff would be more amenable to this if it contained more residential in that space instead, that's a conversation that we could still have. One of the big things that we were trying to also accomplish was maintain that proposed level of 8 units per acre as a gross number. So we're trying to observe both of the key principles that came out of the Planning Commission's analysis of the situation. So in all, we would have just been moving those 8 units per acre to a condensed site, and we would have been producing the park space. We still think it's a great plan. If it needs to be adjusted in some fine details, I think that the property owners are open to that as a concept as well. When it comes to the question of the fiscal reality or feasibility, those are also terms that I think deserve an opportunity to be discussed over a longer period of time rather than just moving into this, I'll call it a down planning that would precede a down zoning, which would really effectively take at least half of the value of this property away from the property owners. They're uniformly opposed to that. Nobody on the property owner side of this equation is at all interested in or is pushing or motivating this land use change. And there's a few important details that I want to cover with that before I sit down. So at any rate, the core of this part of the conversation from the landowner perspective is that this is a proposal. It seems like it moved part of the way down the road that was interesting, but maybe we didn't get all the way there. If the council and the mayor are interested in pursuing a couple of adjusted details of this that would make it palatable, I think the landowners are interested in that conversation. I want to shift gears for just a moment and talk about a couple of other key talking points that will help you all understand this property's history and why I think we've landed where we have. The first is that the property changed ownership very, very recently, 3-4 months ago, from a very tightly held family trust into the sole ownership of the current owner. That prior ownership regime basically tried only to market the grocery store as a grocery store to grocers. They didn't work hard to try other adaptive reuses. The new owner, number one, is much more urgent and serious about having a high-quality adaptive reuse. And number two, has a great history of taking properties that are challenging and doing really great things with them. A couple of the projects under his belt, if you recall, the old Dan Eastman on Main Street Bountiful, that was redeveloped into a close to Class A office complex that has had very high occupancy ever since, and looks great on Main Street. It's an excellent adaptive reuse of a car dealership into a top-notch office facility. Another one is the old Bountiful Post Office, deeper in Bountiful on Main Street, which was also adapted into a highly successful and always rented, always occupied office space. And the third one in St. George, it's called Sunbrook Ranch now, which was easily the ugliest building in all of Dixie. And now is at complete occupancy, fully landscaped, and looks great, and everybody's pleased with it. So this is the kind of new effort and energy and opportunity that's coming into the space with the new ownership. That point's very important to make. There's a couple others, and that's, again, all landowners who actually own land and have decades of their lives and millions of dollars invested in this are not interested in seeing this down planning, down zoning process play out. What they're interested in is gaining, instead of fewer tools to transform the property, they're interested in Centerville City helping to partner by giving them more tools to make this transformation happen. That is the normal way that you do economic development. If you Google right now, in quotes, downzoning for economic development, you will find exactly 0 results across Google's billions and billions and billions of results, because it's not a way to encourage or engender change in a place like this. So moving us to a place where there's more tools is the way that we're going to be able to get the quickest and most effective economic development. And then a final point I would make, I think, is that this approach to taking a fully developed commercial property, even though it's in some stage of depreciation and it needs some investment, but to go through a process to down plan and down zone it is extraordinarily uncommon and extraordinarily aggressive. If you think about the pragmatic reality, if this goes to 8 units an acre, and you think about the properties as they're rented and how you would actually start to plug single-family residences into this property at 6 or 7 or 8 units per acre, look at that picture. It's impossible to conceive how you would actually make that happen. And so what you're setting up, even though 8 units per acre feels like a very safe and happy place, you're setting up a lose-lose situation where there's really no way to engage that property and have a good outcome. You're going to end up with anchor points on it that are stuck in their current land uses for a really long time, and the interior properties are going to have ever more limited uses, and slowly the place will just become more blighted, and everybody's going to be hanging on, doing whatever they can do to rent it and make it work until a real transformation opportunity comes around. So the fewer tools there are, the fewer opportunities those are going to be. That's it from me.
Thank you very much. I'd like to respond to a couple of those, but let's hear if there's anybody else who would like to comment during the public hearing period. Anybody else like to speak?
We got to do something with that.
I knew you couldn't sit there, Dave.
Again, Chad Morris, lifelong resident of Centerville, except for maybe a couple of years in there. But I agree with such a huge piece of property, as I'm assuming you've already heard. It's difficult to have that area is commercial, and I don't, in terms of, I just don't know if there's a lot of it's viable there. But it is a great opportunity to develop and get a higher use in terms of what can be allowed there. And I'm maybe a little bit different in terms of some of you and what you agree to, but there are a lot of people in Centerville who do feel that property rights as a property owner are important, and that we need to not handcuff property owners based on what we feel, but because they own property, they have rights to do certain things. And I know there's important legalities to that and whatnot, but in terms of, I kind of understand a little bit of the history of what was happened with this property, and as Corey stated as well, it's I do feel like a park, you know, it doesn't make sense to just turn it over to a park. There's also park just down the road, an awesome park. I mean, yes, it's in West Bountiful, and I know we don't want our kids going to West Bountiful, but it's literally right down the road, and it's an awesome park. I don't know if we're trying to compete with that or what, but anyway, I do feel like we need to be aware and cognizant of the property owners' abilities to to develop their land as needed, especially a huge piece like this. Anyway, I don't know if that, I'm just rambling, but thank you.
Thanks. Dave, did you want to talk to us or not?
We don't know how old, if we all here that remember why that was even built. Do we all, anybody know? You old enough? Remember the J.C. Penney building when it got built? Because we thought that was going to be the exit, right? Now we're really showing our age. So it didn't happen. UDOT, I guess, is the one that, you know, put the next nail in that and had this building. And thank goodness we did something with the J.C. Penney area. And then even west of the J.C. Penney, you know, we built those nice single-family homes. And this, this is right across the street from the elementary school that my kids went to school in. The ones that now have given me grandkids. So holy moly! What else? I mean, is there? Is there opposition to this? Am I wasting your time? Because if there's opposition to this, I'm wondering, how could that be? Because it's an ugly old parking lot that needs to be resealed, and the building's been empty forever, and it's a blight on the community. As a business owner, and I still own 2 homes in this city, I'm wondering, what do we do? What would we do that wouldn't be this? Especially if a gentleman's coming in here and going to spend good money to do something like this. I mean, I think we ought to bend over backwards and help him to make it happen. That's all I'd say. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Anyone else that would like to comment? If not, I'll close the public hearing, but I think it's fair to the property owners here, if you want to ask a question of them, I think it's fair to do so. I wanted to respond briefly to Mr. Sweeney about the allegation that you're down zoning. There's no change in the zoning here. You could call it down planning. I would view it differently. I think the original purpose of looking at this plan was to try to give more options instead of less options. Right now you have commercial, that there's no effort to remove commercial from one of the options, but their option is also to add a residential option in the going forward. And I think the opposition is not to a well-planned development. The issue is, and my opinion on this is that we should plan the whole area and not just a portion of it. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the design or the concept, but my opposition is we need to have a master plan that's feasible for the whole piece of property, that just turning over one piece of it without having a plan for the rest of it could be a mistake. And if we had a viable plan to get to an end game, or if we had a roadmap to get to a completely redeveloped area, then I think the city council would be a lot more amenable to this, and maybe the city staff too. So I think that my concern is I don't see a roadmap to a long-term future. I see a kind of a spot development that solves only one part of the problem and not the whole area's problem. And I personally would like the parties, all the property owners, to go back to work and say, how can we at least put together a roadmap that shows how we're going to get to a long-term vision, not just let's redevelop the one part that we have, can easily redevelop, but leave the rest of it to try to figure out later.
Well, and when did we see that other concept? Was that 8 months ago? Before this, when this was not, I guess, before this property transfer, we saw
Brighton
development,
Homes,
right?
Which was still only a portion of it.
But it was more contiguous. It was a different development. I mean, there were more than one concept that's been thrown at this. So I agree with the mayor in so much that there is no down zone at this point. It's signaling an intent that there needs to be amendments to the general plan with the anticipation of figuring out something to do with this. I think it would be awful for the council to ignore where it's at now and say, we would like to have action on that. And that based on what the Planning Commission said, what staff has said, and what the various legislators say, I don't think that it's removing tools. It's signaling a willingness by the council to entertain more than less. At least that's my impression of it.
That's my impression as well.
I agree with the mayor. I feel like we were trying to offer more tools, but I have absolutely no problem in just leaving it as it is, that they've got their high density, and I think the property owners are here, and they're asking for us not to change it at this time. We're not hurting anything. We always still have the option once we get a little bit better idea of what we want there to do it. That I have no problem with just leaving them with what they have. One point I would like to make on the plan that we were talking about on the scenario B, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that part of that talks about going back to our mixed-use concept, which is what we're already saying isn't working on the rest of our Main Street where it went, and then it would actually go back to the form-based zoning, and at that point we don't have any knowledge of what the density would be. I am totally against any form-based zoning, and I think our residents came out very loud and clear against the form-based zoning, saying that they would like to know what the density of a piece of property is going to be, and I also feel that way. So I'm great with just letting them keep what they've got.
The other comment that I would remind everybody is that this proposal, if I read it correctly, costs us $750,000 over 3 years, which we do not have money for at the moment. And so I, with that addendum, agree with what's been said and would
Bill, if you could specifically call out that you're in agreement with Paul and we get Stephanie, that's the first time you'll have that. It's kind of a parting gift.
You guys are going to make me feel bad about not running again if you all agree with me on something.
I do agree with Paul and Robin and George.
And I'll add mine to that.
Well, I'll let you do that before I make a motion.
Okay, I agree with Paul, and I like the idea of letting a property owner who's eager to do something with a property have the freedom to go with what they've got right now and see if it works. And if that doesn't pan out and they need to come back and come back to us again and say, hey, let's relook at this, then okay, but let's let them go ahead and try with what they've got, since that seems what they want, and those are the property rights I'm in favor of.
You mean not putting new general plan language in place and keeping it as is for now?
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge with that, or I'd like Corey to speak to the challenge, that one of the reasons we made some amendments to the general plan was there was some inconsistent language in there, and I'm not clear. We took care of some of the school, the north side of Pages Lane. Is that already got updated in the general plan?
Yes, the residential, the north side, all of
got
that has been amended with your residential policies. So then we needed to go back into the Pages Lane because that was, I mean, there's two reasons the impetus. There was a previous goal a few years back to the deterioration. I mean, this has been over 5 years of vacancy. So there's been comment from the city of the past, we need to relook at redeveloping that. Then you had the issues of densities arise and some events that happened inside this neighborhood and the south, or the west, it's the southwest neighborhood. Said, let's go in and fix those. So we took this area, fixed the residential. We've moved the north side into the residential language. So the Pages Lane is no longer covering that. Pages Lane is now east of Main Street, south of Pages, and west of 400 East. And we were tackling it from a redevelopment perspective. So if you're inclined, we have the Planning Commission recommendation. You have a modification of the Planning Commission's recommendation if we're moving forward with the past effort. But if you're so inclined that you just want to leave it as is, the Pages Lane area, we can simply rewrite the Pages Lane to stay in its form bring that back to you for consideration.
Okay, so I'm going to just backtrack a little bit to the work session, though. The reason we had the work session is that we had this goal to put something in place in this area for the entire year. And we were finally getting around to it. And we also, at the same time, had a suggested possibility. And the sentiment that I went away from that work session with was that we wanted to let the market speak to us about all of the different possibilities. But we want whatever those different possibilities would be to fit in to a cohesive plan. So we wanted some design standards and some expectations set. And in reading, so first of all, to that point, I was really surprised with how the process at the Planning Commission went, that all of a sudden we were talking about such a drastic change, such as acres of park. When I thought the directive was, let's make sure that when the market speaks to us and says, we want to do this, that we're allowing it with flexibility, but that it's going to be a quality product for the area. So when I read this general plan language, agreeing with Paul, I don't read it as a narrowing, but as doing just that. Other than the park bit, which is kind of a whole separate goal number 2, right? I'm reading it as that. So if you'll just bear with me, on the eastern half, it's saying that it has struggled, and that's true. And then it just says, for goal number 1, consider various options to promote the block area's redevelopment that balances the need to reverse the decline while respecting the remaining viable commercial uses. So we're not taking away the commercial uses. Objective A, consider allowing residential development. So this doesn't say at all, we want this to turn residential away from commercial. It's for the first time saying, consider allowing it to be residential, but of sufficient size that it would be a good transition, that it would transition the existing commercial to becoming a new residential neighborhood. That's just saying consider that as a possibility. Again, my interpretation is if the market comes with that option and wants it. Objective B, consider allowing up to a medium density, et cetera, dwellings are to be designed, et cetera, some design standards. Objective C, ensure that the residential development that we might be considering, if the market comes and wants it, establishes a buffer between the western commercial and the residential with open space and landscaping. Objective D, if residential is developed, the layout and positioning of accesses, roadways, dwellings are to be designed in a manner to allow an integration of additional future conversion and commercial to residential uses. So currently, we just have a commercial high allowance there with no language saying we would welcome residential. Not only that, but we don't really have any expectation or design standards about the sensitivity to the surrounding neighborhoods. So when I read this proposed language, I just read that it's still absolutely allowing the existing commercial high use, but that we want to be sensitive to the neighborhoods, and if someone wants to propose some residential in there, we're open to considering that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement of what grew into it, and it was also coupled with a proposal at 8 units an acre for a portion of the property that at the time, say 8 months ago, was being argued as marketable. We were just saying, okay, if we might move that direction, we need to adjust that market that seemingly there. Maybe it's disappeared now, but it was seemingly there, so that if it does convert, it's a sufficient size, layout, roads, and connections to make sure that the future transitions and conversion away from commercial happen. So, down planning, it's a relative term. I mean, I think the extreme version of the interpretation is you're changing the general plan and tomorrow you're coming in and rezoning everything. I think that's, I agree with the sentiments that have been everybody's expressed. It was trying to open up more tools, and those tools we were hearing from the property owner and interested agent to buy the property saying, we think the market can transition to this. And we just said, well, we don't want it to be, the original plan was walls. It was going to be a new fort.
Right.
Fort Pages Lane. And we were trying to say that's not really what we want. But into it, Brighton came in the middle of the process when their plan was rejected and said, look, we can do it as single family, close setbacks. We could do it as the twin homes with the 2 end units that they build on the Hofoka property. Even they were exploring various ideas that seemed marketable. So to me, it's what do I say the strong language that we're down planning and down zoning was not what we were hearing from everybody during this process. What did kind of maybe hijack, for lack of better terms, is the park issue. And they are responding because they experienced the strength of that park issue.
At the Planning Commission level, but we haven't really been able to fully explore it
at the council level. Now they're saying, hey, let's go explore the park issue. Right. And at this point, we're saying we've explored it to this level because the funds are not there to attrition it into a park or the commitment. That's what we're feeling at staff in the next 3 to 5 years. So,
and we don't have a master plan that really fits the park.
Right.
Now we have a spot park.
So to me, going back and saying we discussed the meaningful park, let's take the other option of the residential and consider it and allow that language of flexibility, and then allow them to go back and say, okay, we've answered the park. I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to answer what they were hearing through that process.
Right.
The return is okay, the park's not going to come about. Now we're still thinking about considering residential, make it more meaningful residential, set it up so that it can attrition the rest of the property. Maybe the adaptive reuses could work, maybe from my perspective in the current format, not really. It's isolating the residential. It's not meaningful residential. So, if you pass the plan tonight, there's still flexibility in my mind for them to come back and propose a residential, component.
That's where I stand right now, is that if we pass it tonight, it doesn't limit at all the next steps that you want to take, and I'm glad to hear that as property owners you want to take next steps to get us there. I also apologize that I'm sure it feels kind of like whiplash because you were hearing this strong sentiment from the Planning Commission, but they're not obligated to consider the finances, the economics of it. And we hadn't even, this is the first it has come to us to evaluate, is this realistic, right? But I don't think that putting this in place takes away that power to propose lots of creative options. And I do think it puts really important protections in place for us. Because if the general plan language states whether it stays commercial high that you're proposing to us, or whether it's a residential, or whether it's a mix of the 2 uses, we are going to check it against these standards. How well does it blend in with the neighboring residential area? How well does it connect for the future transformation?
And that still requires a zoning amendment. So I'm not opposed to the language change for 2 reasons. 1, it provides more tools in my opinion. 2, it signals very loudly as a community, we want something done with the property. It's been blighted for a long time. I don't think that it's a strong arm tactic as much as the community saying there's enough concern that it's made it through the various levels of governance to give options here and to say, okay, let's do something with it. I recognize that they've now consolidated to one property owner, and that may be enough impetus to make something happen, but I don't think it negates the need for the council to say, we're taking an action because we would like to see something happen. I think it'd be worse to be completely inactive on it.
I agree. Just one point for clarification, because I've had discussion with Councilmember Meekum. The mixed use is for the western half, returning to the form-based code, so it doesn't involve the eastern half. The eastern half is the transition to residential. The western half is saying leave it commercial in place now, and then consider 2 other options. Return to the South Main Street overlay as a gateway, or consider some other mixed use component. And I just want to make sure that the mixed use is not the proposal on the east side.
And does that have to be in there? So right now you're saying, we're saying west half of Pages Lane is commercial, but from a planning perspective, you can consider some of these other things. We're not doing anything. We're not making any changes. We're not going back to mixed use. We're just saying consider it.
Consider it.
East half, it's commercial, but
consider the residential
consider other
transition.
options in moving forward.
And I did want to make a clarification that form-based does not equal unregulated density. In the Main Street overlay, that was how it was originally written, is the form-based controls and the small size of the lots were going to control the density. But that has now been resolved by adding density limits. The exact same thing can happen. Form-based code can exist with density limits.
In multiple forms,
Yeah.
correct.
So.
But there is a iconic connection of form-based code to the density issues from the past. There is that mental connection and reaction of everybody to it. So.
But then to your point as well, that mixed use doesn't have to equal form-based code either.
Correct. It could be mixed sector.
And this language just says respect the viable commercial uses now, and in the future possibly consider mixed use again.
Right.
That's all it says. Right. So I would actually make a motion that we approve the language with the amended recommendation from staff that we take out objective, or the option A for goal number 2, and make it just option B, so that we are considering having some kind of open space element that benefits the area when it's redeveloped, but not saying it has to be a park. Did that make sense?
So I have a motion on the table to approve the general plan amendments for section 124082 around Page Lane with the recommended modification by staff to remove the park option and just focus on additional tools for residential. Yeah. Is there a second to that motion? If there's not a second, then I'll rule it fails for lack of a second. Is there an alternative motion? You want to think about this for a few more months?
No, I'd like to think about it for a few more minutes.
Okay.
Reading,
Can we take a break and have 5 minutes? Come back, or you want to do this now? Not deliberating, just,
Yeah, I'd be willing to consider that, and as property owner wants to make a comment, Lisa, are you going to get upset with me if I allow him to make a comment? Would you like to if you want to make a comment, please come to the microphone. And then I think a 5-minute break would actually be good.
Been here since 5, so.
Thank you. These processes are always difficult. Have you ever seen one of these?
Do you want to state your name for the record, please, Mark?
Marvin Blosh. I'm with Dicka Properties. My wife Linda is the representative, the owner of Dicka Properties. I own Vicor Construction. I'm the one who did most of the properties that Buck explained and talked about. We're ready to move and take action. Normally what we would do if we were trying to deal with somebody is negotiate. And maybe that's what would be helpful too, from my perspective, is if you folks stepped forward and said, we can't afford a park, but maybe a 2-acre park, but maybe we could afford a 1-acre park. Or is a 1-acre park meaningful? Maybe it's not. But if you give us feedback, maybe we can respond. And I know what you've done is you've tried to be helpful. But in the spirit of negotiation, we talk about density, and we hear these numbers 4 and 6 and 8 and 10. We have a magic number, and we hit that number. It's about 12. We can make this work. We could also make it work maybe with a 1-acre park. There's some things we can do in the give and take process. So, you're not going to hurt our feelings if you come up and say, here's some stuff we can do. Maybe you're not in that attitude where you want to deal like that, but it would be helpful to us so we can respond. As was said, we have responded to what we've heard for the last 8 months and tried to do something that we thought would be decent and work for everybody, and I think we did a pretty good job of that. And so we're ready, willing, and able, but give us feedback. It'll really be helpful. Thank you for your efforts. Appreciate you.
I appreciate those comments, Marv. I think that was helpful. I think there's very much a willingness to consider other options. I'd also encourage you to negotiate with other property owners to get a more cohesive plan for the larger property. I think that's really the issue for many of us, is having residential commercial is a concern. And if there was at least a roadmap to get to a cohesive plan all the way to Fourth East, I think it would make many of us feel more comfortable from a planning perspective. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break. You've been here since 5:30, and then you can come back and decide if you're going to take action, or move on, or table it, or move on.
Everybody. Well, I'm saying you can take a break, but you can't.